Hello, and welcome to the importance of addressing on-off times in Parkinson's. Thank you for joining us via Zoom or from Facebook. I'm Jenny Fearday, a Community Engagement Manager for the Parkinson's Foundation. Helping me behind the scenes are my colleagues Madison Watkins and Danielle Palo. We warmly welcome you to the webinar today, especially anyone joining us for the first time. Please note that we are recording today's presentation and you will receive a follow-up email from us with a link to today's recording and slides. We would like to know who is joining us today. Please take a moment to share your connection to Parkinson's disease in the chat button. And for those of you joining us from Facebook, please share your location as well. As we begin, we want to welcome you and take a moment to share the mission of the Parkinson's Foundation. Every day and in everything we do, we are working to make life better for people with Parkinson's. To achieve our mission, we pursue three goals: improve care for everyone with Parkinson's, advance research toward a cure, and empower and educate our global community. Today's program is a great example of one of the things we are doing to help us meet these goals. One example of our mission in action is PD generation. This research offers genetic testing for PD-related genes and genetic counseling to people with Parkinson's at no cost. Commit to helping us advance Parkinson's research today. Check your eligibility and enroll now to be part of PD Generation at parkinson.org PD Generation. Now I'd like to take a moment to recognize that today's sponsor for the PD Health at Home is presented by AbbVie Inc., whose generosity has made this program possible. The Parkinson's Foundation continues to provide weekly educational and wellness programs virtually through our PD Health at Home series, including Mindfulness Mondays, Wellness Wednesdays, and Fitness Fridays. As a reminder, all programs are held at the same time, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. You can learn more and register for these programs by visiting parkinson.org PD Health. My PD Care was developed in collaboration with AbbVie Inc., an international group of movement disorder specialists, and Parkinson's Foundation. My PD Care is a questionnaire designed to assist you and your healthcare provider to better understand your current Parkinson's disease symptom status to determine the best course of treatment for you. The My PD Care questionnaire is intended for patients and/or care partners to complete and discuss the results with their treating healthcare provider. This questionnaire takes approximately 5 minutes to complete. Now, if you do not want to answer the questionnaire on the web page, you can also download and print the questionnaire to complete on a paper copy. Upon completion of the online questionnaire, a summary will be generated that you can use to help guide your conversation with your Parkinson's healthcare provider at your next visit. Now, I am now pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Joohi Jimenez-Shahed. Dr. Jimenez-Shahed is the Medical Director of Movement Disorders, Neuromodulation, and Brain Circuit Therapeutics at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. After completing her undergraduate degree at Washington University in St. Louis, Dr. Jimenez-Shahed received her medical degree from Baylor College of Medicine and neurology residency training at Duke University Medical Center. Dr. Jimenez-Shahed serves as chair of the Functional Neurosurgical Working Group of the Parkinson Study Group and chair of the Science Advisory Board of the Davis Phinney Foundation for Parkinson. Welcome, Dr. Jimenez-Shahed.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to present today. It's my pleasure to be able to talk to everyone about addressing on-off time in Parkinson's. So give me 1 second here and let me get the share screen going. Hopefully you can see my slides. And I just want to say good morning or good afternoon to all our attendees, wherever you might be. Happy that you were able to join us today in discussing this important topic. So I will start here just in a moment. Okay, with our learning objectives. So the first part we'll go through is just understanding motor fluctuations or on-off times in Parkinson's disease. We'll then talk a little bit about the physical and emotional impact of motor fluctuations on daily activities and really try to understand why it's important to be able to increase on time or to maximize it as much as possible for patients. And then at the third part, we'll talk a little bit about the different care options that can help patients achieve more consistent on time. And in the context of that discussion, we'll talk about what is a continuous delivery system and how do those really help to promote on time. So first, let's get started with what are motor fluctuations. You may have heard this term. Some people may refer to it in different ways. But generally speaking, when we talk about motor fluctuations, it's a good idea to take a step back and just talk about what our treatment goals are in Parkinson's disease. So first and foremost, when we are prescribing medications to manage Parkinson's symptoms, we're primarily looking at ways to maintain or improve motor symptom control. That might be related to issues surrounding maintaining functional independence. So patients may experience difficulties at work. They might have difficulties doing their hobbies or engaging in other leisure activities. And certainly we want to make sure that they can maintain their ability to participate in all of those things at the level that they wish to do so. We also focus our attentions on maintaining quality of life. So if there are opportunities to do that by improving motor symptom control, we certainly want to be able to do that. Also improving social functioning. We know that a lot of symptoms that patients experience might be embarrassing. It might lead them to withdraw socially. So we want them to be able to be as functional as possible in that standpoint and engage in those activities as well. And as you all probably know, levodopa is the gold standard of therapy, and this is what we have been using since the 1960s. There's been a few sort of dips and turns in terms of whether that medication has been on the top of the list for what to use for Parkinson's disease, but generally speaking, it is what is going to be kind of converted into dopamine in your brain, and that's why we consider it to be the gold standard. Now, other goals of treatment include addressing non-motor features. We're probably not going to get into that in a whole lot of detail today, but we know that non-motor features of Parkinson's also impact patients' quality of life, and so we try to address those when we can. And when we're choosing our therapies in Parkinson's, we're often thinking about how to minimize those long-term complications and what are sort of some smart decisions that we can make about the therapeutic recommendations in order to manage those or mitigate those in the future. And lastly, it's important to note that the treatment regimen is very individualized for each patient. And so what may work or what may be suggested by a doctor for one patient might be different than what is recommended by somebody else for a different patient. So I mentioned how levodopa is the gold standard, but we know that it comes with its challenges. And this is kind of a nice summary slide that demonstrates the disease progression and the influence that treatment has on the progression in Parkinson's disease. So when individuals are first diagnosed, they may not have started any treatment right away, and symptoms may be mild or moderate. They may be able to function quite well, either with small doses of medications or without medications at all. Once patients begin treatment with medication for Parkinson's, generally speaking at the beginning, we call this the honeymoon period, where there is satisfactory control of motor symptoms and patients may even feel like they don't have any symptoms of Parkinson's at all. But at some point, that level of control becomes suboptimal and patients begin experiencing more obvious motor symptoms, whether that's the tremor, the stiffness, the slowness, the gait changes. Any of those different features can start to become harder to control. And usually in that phase starts requiring combinations of medications. And eventually patients may start experiencing what we call response fluctuations, where they feel periods of time where the medications are working well and periods of time where they are not working well. Those kind of fluctuations tend to intensify and become more obvious. And in the more advanced stages of Parkinson's disease, patients may experience both motor and non-motor complications of the disease state. So this is kind of the general progression. Obviously, it's different for different people, but generally speaking, this would not be an unusual sort of set of evolution of features of Parkinson's disease. And so it's important to think about some of the reasons why that may be. And first and foremost, obviously, we know that this is a degenerative condition. We know that the changes that are happening in the brain are not things that we are stopping with the treatment that we are giving. However, levodopa, as we said, being the gold standard of treatment, has been very substantially helpful for a lot of patients in terms of improving and controlling these motor symptoms. But we know that there's many challenges associated with its use. And so this slide really kind of goes through the journey of a levodopa pill, for example, as it's going from the mouth once you swallow it all the way into the brain. The first thing that we know that needs to happen, of course, is that you get the tablet, you swallow it. And we know that for some people with Parkinson's symptoms, the swallowing function may be compromised, and that could create some difficulty in how well that medication gets in. Once the medication gets in, it has to make its way to the stomach. And in the stomach, we know that there can be differences in how well the stomach is moving and kind of absorbing the medication or breaking it down for delivery to the small intestine, where it's actually then absorbed. And that's what's referred to here on number 3, the jejunum. That's a portion of the small intestine where it is actually the primary site of absorption of this medication. So when the medicine gets into this part of your small intestine, it has to get absorbed across the gut into the bloodstream. And this can be challenging for some individuals because we know that dietary proteins and amino acids can compete with the absorption of the levodopa. And so this is why sometimes you've heard that when you take your medication, you shouldn't take it with a high protein meal, or that some people who do take it with a high protein meal may notice that the medication is not kicking in as well, or that it's not lasting as long. Once the medicine gets absorbed across the intestinal wall into the bloodstream, it has an opportunity to circulate around the body, and hopefully it's making its way up to the brain. But as it's doing that, it has the possibility of being broken down by a couple of different enzymes that are in our general kind of body structures. And when these enzymes start breaking down the levodopa, what that means is that there's less of it that can get up to the brain and get absorbed into the central nervous system, where we actually need it to improve motor functioning. Once the medication makes its way up to the brain, there is another kind of normal defense mechanism that we have that is called the blood-brain barrier. And here, you have to think of the blood-brain barrier as a way of kind of protecting the brain against substances that aren't wanted. And so it makes kind of this little barrier that some molecules, including levodopa, have to work a little bit harder to get across. And so there is a transporter that has to be used here, which can also be blocked by other amino acids or proteins that also need to be absorbed using the same transporter. And so sometimes that can create some challenges with how much of the levodopa actually gets into the brain. And then eventually, if the levodopa can make it through all of these different steps, once it's in the striatum, which is those deep brain structures where the movement control is kind of concentrated, that's where the levodopa actually gets converted to dopamine and gets to do its business in terms of helping improve patients' movements. So this is an important sort of sequence of things to remember, because it'll come into play as we discuss things in the remainder of this presentation. But the reason that we're talking about it is because all of these different steps, if anything goes wrong in any one of those, and sometimes we have challenges in multiple of those different areas, this can lead to or kind of create problems with what we call motor complications. And one of the most common motor complications, and certainly the focus of our discussion today, is motor fluctuations. So motor fluctuations really refers to this period of off times and on times. Off times are generally considered to be a period of relatively poor overall function. Patients are often experiencing more Parkinson's symptoms during this time. They may describe this in a lot of different ways, including maybe just feeling bad, maybe having more anxiety or depression, having some painful muscle tightening. Often they feel that it's slower. That they are moving slower, or that it's harder to move. There might be more shuffling or gait or posture issues. Even non-motor symptoms can be present during this time as well. And usually these off periods relate to lower dopamine levels. On periods, on the other hand, are periods of relatively good overall function and mobility, where patients have less Parkinson's symptoms. They generally describe feeling good, mood is better, pain is improved, movements are easier, tremor is better controlled, walking and balance are more normal. And this is generally a period of time that relates to having higher dopamine levels in the system. So this is what we're really kind of talking about with on-off and with motor fluctuations. And what will generally happen during the course of a day is what's depicted here on this slide. And so the top part of this graph here are periods that we would refer to as on time, where symptoms are adequately controlled. And the bottom part of this graph is referring to what happens during off times, when symptoms are not adequately controlled, as we talked about. So if you imagine taking a dose of levodopa, you know the path now that it has to take to get into the brain. But as it kicks in and gets where it needs to go, patients will start feeling like like their symptoms are alleviated. But at some point, the levodopa starts running its course and the body starts trying to get kind of rid of it, as normally happens with medications. And once those dopamine levels start to fall, the symptoms begin to return. And again, the patient will take another dose of medication and they'll feel that it starts to work. The symptoms will get better. And so again, this is happening multiple times throughout the day as individuals take multiple doses of medications. And the period that we're talking about where the dopamine levels are low are what we also refer to as wearing off periods. And during that time, patients can have these wearing off symptoms. So one thing to remember about wearing off symptoms and just Parkinson's management in general is that timing of medications is extremely important. And I've kind of given these examples here. Don't take them with absolute certainty because they're just cartoon representations. But for example, if you were taking your medications every 8 hours throughout the course of a day, you might take a dose of medication, it would kick in, it would wear off. You would take another dose, it would kick in and wear off. And really there would be this kind of downtime where the dopamine levels are relatively lower in the brain, and the period of time that it takes for the medicine to wear off and then kick back in could be relatively prolonged. If at the same point in time you shifted to taking your medications every 6 hours, then you notice that that duration of the time that the dopamine levels are lower is shorter, but the response fluctuations are still there. And even if you think about taking medications every 4 hours, this is getting shorter and shorter, and you can see how we're doing a better job of kind of keeping those dopamine levels higher and higher. And while this is particularly helpful, what we actually want to be able to do is to ensure that we don't have very many of those dips that are associated with the low dopamine levels and hence the off symptoms. And so really trying to get that timing so that you're taking your next dose of medications before the first one completely wears off is really what we want to try to do, or we want to try to use combinations of medications to prevent it from completely wearing off. So hopefully that makes sense, but I think the point is just that it really is important for patients to be taking their medications on a regular schedule. So when we do that and kind of stay ahead of the story a little bit, you can see that we really don't kind of get to those low dopamine levels, and you have more continuous dopamine levels in the system. Now, when we talk about the wearing off, we have predominantly been focusing on what happens when the dopamine levels fall, and that's kind of a typical wearing off at the end of dose. Sometimes it's referred to as end of dose wearing off. And so you can imagine here on this graph on the top line where a patient takes the dose of levodopa, like we talked about, it takes a period of time to kick in, and then it wears off and the symptoms start returning. There are also off phenomenon that are described as delayed on, and this is where a patient may take the dose of levodopa, and rather than taking the usual 30-40 minutes to kick in, it takes longer, like maybe an hour and a half. And so patients have to wait longer in order for that medication to kick in. But once it does, it kicks in, they get there on time, and then the medication wears off. There are also situations where patients may get dose failures, where they take a dose of medication and it never kicks in, and they really don't feel that on until they take subsequent doses during the course of their day. And then sometimes, usually in more advanced stages of the disease, patients can have these random on and off phenomenon where it doesn't really seem to match very closely with the timings that they take their medications. And so sometimes the meds may kick in well, sometimes they may take longer to kick in, sometimes they may not kick in, and you get that kind of unpredictable on-off fluctuation. And so these are different types of off situations that can happen, and usually are related to different things going on along that pathway of levodopa absorption and levodopa getting into the brain. Now, there are some other ways that people have described off episodes. Some patients may experience what we call morning off episodes, where when you're waiting for that first dose of medications to kick in, then there are more prominent Parkinson's symptoms. And this often has to do with the fact that patients have gone all night without taking a dose of medications or have gone for a prolonged period. And so they're really kind of bottomed out in terms of those dopamine levels. Sometimes that is problematic because these off symptoms in the morning are much more worse than any of the off off symptoms that they'll experience during the rest of the day, simply because those levels have bottomed out so much. We talked about delayed on, we talked about wearing off. The other thing that we didn't really talk about in the previous slide was a sudden off phenomenon. And that's another thing that can happen with these off symptoms, where patients are expecting the medication to kind of gradually wear off, but instead, for whatever reason, there's this sort of rapid loss of that effect, which can happen over seconds and even just a few minutes. And that can be very challenging, as you can imagine, to manage throughout the course of a day. So it's hard to talk about motor fluctuations without also briefly talking about dyskinesias, because they tend to go hand in hand, or at least if one has happened, then the other is probably also occurring. So dyskinesias are slow, writhing, involuntary movements that typically occur when levodopa is at higher levels in the brain, although that's not always the case, as we'll see in a minute. But the challenge with the dyskinesias is that they can start happening even if there isn't a dosage change in the levodopa. And the reason for that is that this isn't purely just a side effect of the medication. And so it's always a little bit of a challenge to help people understand that dyskinesia is not purely just a side effect of levodopa. It also has to do with the fact that the remaining dopamine cells in the brain have a really hard time buffering changes in the dopamine levels that the brain is being exposed to by taking these high doses of medications repeatedly and intermittently throughout the day. And so dyskinesias really are due to a combination of the medications themselves, plus the underlying Parkinson's disease. And it's just one of the other things that we need to be able to manage as we're choosing our medications for Parkinson's symptom control. Now, risk factors for dyskinesias can include things like younger age at onset of Parkinson's, certainly higher total daily levodopa dosage. Usually dyskinesias will develop in patients who have already experienced motor fluctuations. And we also have evidence that individuals with lower body weight might be at greater risk of developing dyskinesias. But just like the on-off phenomenon, the dyskinesias can also fluctuate between doses of medications. And so the most common one is here, what we're showing in the red bar on this figure, where a patient has taken the dose of medication, it's kicked in, and this dopamine level is at its highest. That is usually what we call a peak dose dyskinesia, but there are dyskinesias that can happen at other times. And for some people, the dyskinesia will actually happen as the medication is kicking in and getting to the brain. And again, as the medication is wearing off and those dopamine levels are falling. And so those are something that we refer to as diphasic dyskinesia. And sometimes those are a little bit more challenging to manage. But it's important to know what the pattern of the dyskinesia is, because again, that will impact our decision-making in terms of medication management. So what is the impact of motor fluctuations on patients with Parkinson's? Well, we know that about 40% of patients with Parkinson's will experience off episodes within 4 to 6 years of starting oral levodopa treatment. And 70% of patients will actually experience it after 9 or more years. So it's something that is likely to happen for the vast majority of individuals who are dealing with this condition. Definitely something we need to pay attention to. Some of the symptoms that people will describe related to wearing off are as follows. Maybe it's reduced dexterity, slowness of the movement, stiffness, tremor, trouble with walking or balance, difficulty getting out of a chair, trouble swallowing, cramping of the muscles, speech changes, generally just feeling tired or more achy or having more pain. Other non-motor symptoms can include things like anxiety or panic attacks, cloudiness of thinking or dullness of thinking. Some patients have described discomfort in the chest or abdominal regions, sweating changes, mood changes, abnormal sensations of hot and cold. And so people can experience a number of different things related to these on and off phenomenon. Now, what we do know is that patients are more likely to develop more wearing off symptoms as the disease duration increases. And so if you think about all those different potential symptoms that patients have, and you start asking the question, how many of these symptoms of wearing off are you experiencing? We can see that the longer that an individual has Parkinson's disease, then the more of these symptoms that patients will begin to experience. And so here you have the division between somebody who has less less than 2.5 years worth of disease, 2.5 to 5 years, up to 10 years, more than 10 years. And really the motor wearing off symptoms certainly are more prominent than the non-motor wearing off symptoms, but you get the idea that more and more symptoms are experienced by individuals as the disease progresses. Now, wearing off always happens in patients who are taking levodopa. In this study, which was several hundred patients, 94% of the patients that were experiencing wearing off were taking levodopa, and usually they were taking it in combination with other medications. We know that things like age, gender, the severity of the ability to perform activities of daily living, and even duration of Parkinson's disease treatment are all features that can be significantly associated with wearing off. And we also know that individuals who report wearing off have worse quality of life on different measures. Here in this study, it was the PDQ-8, worse quality of life than subjects who don't experience wearing off. So it's certainly a problem that impacts patients' day-to-day functioning. Now, in this survey of physicians, patients, and care partners, the most common off symptoms that were reported by patients included things like stiffness, slowness of movement, and changes in gait. If you asked care partners about it, they were more likely to report the wearing off symptoms than the patients were. So sometimes it's always helpful, at least from my perspective as a clinician, to be able to have somebody else's input on what they're observing or what is happening with the patient. If you survey neurologists such as myself, unfortunately, it's still something that's hard for some neurologists to recognize, especially when patients are experiencing non-motor symptoms. And so it was harder for them to recognize things like pain, sweating, or anxiety as possible symptoms of off episodes. And so for that reason, it's really important for our patients to be able to tell us what the different symptoms are that they are experiencing. And then if we look at what the most impactful off symptoms were, patients were more likely to be bothered by the gait, slowness, and stiffness. And care partners of patients with Parkinson's disease were more feeling like the cognitive impairments were more impactful and creating greater difficulty for the individual with Parkinson's disease. So this is another table that kind of describes the experience that patients have with their off episodes. And here is a list of different triggers that patients reported in this survey study. So things like being under more stress, having specific anxiety or depression symptoms, having more tiredness or fatigue, like if you hadn't slept very well, being in social situations was sometimes more likely to trigger off episodes. Cold or heat exposure was reported by some patients. Again, stress issues, maybe this time in this list related to family issues, emotionality like anger and being upset. Some patients associated it with food intake, some related it to medications, others maybe the stress of driving, and certainly a number of other miscellaneous factors that seem to have triggered off episodes in some patients. So really we recognize that although there's this relationship to the medication dosing, that there are certainly external factors that can also aggravate the situation and create or make it more likely for patients to experience off times. Now, if you ask patients, these same patients who reported these triggering factors, what they did to kind of alleviate their off periods, they had a number of different strategies that they used. So hopefully some of these are helpful for you to think about as well in your day-to-day kind of living with Parkinson's disease. Some patients reported being able to exercise and to kind of shorten their off episodes that way. Some just took a break and relaxed and waited for it to pass. Others reported mindfulness or positive thinking, breathing exercises to try to alleviate the symptoms. Some patients just called it a day and took a nap or went to sleep during that period. Others might have tried to drink or eat something, maybe changing their activity to something else, reading to kind of maybe take their mind off the symptoms that they were experiencing, listening to music, playing on their technology devices, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a number of different strategies that might be helpful to cope with these off symptoms when they occur. And I think each individual will sort of come to what it is they consider to be most helpful for them. Now, thinking further about what the impact of off episodes, obviously there's the obvious thing related to motor functioning and being able to get through your day, but there's also a growing body of evidence that there are far more than just physical impacts of off episodes in patients with Parkinson's disease. And this survey was people with Parkinson's who were still working, and categorized patients according to whether they had off periods, and those are the patients that are shown in the darker blue, versus those individuals with Parkinson's who did not have off periods. And this was looking at two things: the number of missed work days per month and the number of less productive work days per month. And what you can see here across the board is, regardless of the number of actual days or the number of less productive days, people with off symptoms were having more problems in these areas than individuals without off symptoms. So we know that it really can have an impact on in this particular realm of work productivity and work activity. Additional kind of tidbits about individuals who are experiencing off features: they tend to have more need for a primary caregiver, maybe even a secondary caregiver, compared to individuals who don't have off episodes. When in this survey, they looked at the primary and secondary caregivers and the number of hours that they were spending, and specifically the unpaid hours that they were spending taking care of patients. There were more of those in the care of patients with off episodes as opposed to patients who didn't have off episodes. Caregivers, the proportion of caregivers who were reporting that Parkinson's had a major role in their own decision to stop working was higher in individuals with off versus individuals without off. And caregivers reporting reduced or changed working hours, lost opportunities, or the inability to keep a job for reasons related to Parkinson's was also higher when they were caring for somebody who was experiencing off episodes compared to somebody who was not experiencing off episodes. So again, more widespread impacts of this phenomenon that can affect also the caregivers and care providers for individuals with Parkinson's disease. Now, this was a graph looking at the annual income of caregivers with patients with Parkinson's, and I think along the lines of the same conversation that we have been having, there was a greater chance of loss in annual earnings in individuals who were caregivers for patients with off episodes. So this was from a poster that I had the opportunity to present at the American Academy of Neurology meeting earlier this year, and it was really trying to put a clinical and humanistic value on this whole idea of having good on time. So usually, you know, having more off time correlates with having less good on time, right? So they kind of can be looked at sort of interchangeably from that standpoint. And in this particular report, what we were able to describe is the different measures of economic or clinical or humanistic value that could be associated with increasing the on time. So for every hour increase in good on time, we could see that there was a 20% lower chance of having uncontrolled motor symptoms. For every hour of increase in good on time, there was a 12% lower chance of having uncontrolled non-motor symptoms. For every 1 hour increase in good on time, there was a 9% reduction in the number of falls that patients were experiencing, and a 9% reduction in the likelihood of needing to take more Parkinson's medications. From a humanistic value, having a 1 hour increase in good on time allowed for 19% higher likelihood of independence in performing activities of daily living. The next set of measures here relates to quality of life. And so increases in on time were associated with improvements in quality of life, and also with a decrease in caregiver burden. And that was shown on this Zarit burden interview score. Now, from an economic standpoint, every 1 hour increase in good on time was associated with a $7,000 total healthcare resource utilization cost saving. Okay, so there are more healthcare costs that are associated with having more off time. There was also 11% lower chance of hospitalization, 8% reduction in ER visits, and a lower likelihood, 11% lower likelihood of requiring professional care. So each of these on its own could certainly be significantly impactful, but when you sort of consider the fact that multiple of these factors might be at play in any individual patient with off time, you can imagine that the benefits can be quite substantial if we can work harder to get patients to have more consistent on time. So what are some of the treatment options that we have to increase on time? So this is just kind of a summary slide that tells us or kind of tries to show the spectrum of treatments and medications that we have to manage Parkinson's disease. And it kind of tries to show the time frame in which we can use these medications. And probably the thing to focus on is that levodopa or carbidopa-levodopa, sometimes called Sinai, Parcopa, Rytary. These are different formulations of that medication. Once you start taking one of these types of medications, that's usually the situation where patients will start to experience the off time. And then we may have combinations of medications that we think about, whether it is one of those COMT inhibitors to help that medication last longer, maybe it's rescue therapies to help bridge the gaps between doses of medication, or maybe it is some of the advanced therapies such as Duopa, which is the levodopa pump, or even something like deep brain stimulation. So I think the kind of hard part about Parkinson's disease and part of the challenge in dealing with this symptom complex and trying to maintain those dopamine levels is that polypharmacy is often required. So what is polypharmacy? Polypharmacy is the simultaneous use of multiple medications to treat a single ailment or condition. And unfortunately, this is sort of like more the rule in Parkinson's disease. I think in certain conditions and different situations, polypharmacy is kind of a bad word, and we sort of want to avoid it as much as possible, but it's really a necessity in the effective management of Parkinson's disease, especially as the disease progresses and there are increases in those motor complications, as we talked about. And what we generally need to try to do, and part of the reason that we are using these combinations of medications, is because we're trying to balance the clinical benefits, meaning moving better and being on more consistently, with the risk of having the dyskinesia. And so that's why balancing and using those combinations ends up being necessary. But really, the fact that the medications are delivered intermittently is actually possibly also contributing to the problem, meaning kind of getting back to that idea that I had mentioned earlier, that as time goes on, the brain has a harder time handling the bursts of dopamine intake. And so the fact that we have to keep dosing it intermittently in order to maintain those dopamine levels can somehow just sort of drive and perpetuate the problem. So it can really be a challenge to try to figure out the right way to do this. Generally speaking, though, what we have been learning and what we understand is that medications with more continuous drug delivery are actually beneficial in addressing this problem. So ideally, if you could take that dopamine delivery to the brain and make it more continuous and more smooth, then the chance exists that we won't have as many of those dips and those fluctuations. So this is what this kind of cartoon picture is showing. If you take the levodopa and throughout the course of the day, you could somehow manage to have those dopamine levels higher and kind of maintained at a regular state throughout the course of that day as the patient is awake and trying to function in their day-to-day activities, versus the situation with intermittent oral levodopa dosing, where you take a dose, it kicks in, it wears off, you take another dose, it kicks in, it wears off, right? So it kind of makes sense that if we could achieve that, then that might make things a lot easier for patients. And sometimes that is easier said than done. Certainly a great idea, but there have been some important steps in the right direction to try to make this happen. And what we have seen with some of these medications, which we'll talk about in the next slides, is that they tend to help reduce those dose-related side effects of medications, and also likely reduce or minimize the dyskinesia, along with keeping patients feeling on more consistently during the day. So some of the strategies that have been available to create more continuous drug delivery so that patients maintain those dopamine levels a little bit better are as follows. We have seen several different extended release versions of oral medications. We have patches, which can allow medications to be absorbed across the skin. We have drugs that can be given that have a shorter duration of action, meaning that they will kick in quicker. These are often used as rescue therapies. And then we also have pumps, which are continuous delivery systems, which can be delivered either, again, under the skin or actually into the GI tract directly. And we'll talk about some of these in the next slides. So the extended release formulations were probably the first strategy that was developed to try to combat this sort of fluctuation problem and the fact that the medications tend to not last as long as time goes on. And so there's been several of them. Pramipexole, which is one of the dopamine agonists, ropinirole, another dopamine agonist, both have extended release formulations. Carbidopa-levodopa has an extended release formulation, but there's also a extended release capsule, which can also also be beneficial. And then amantadine, which is actually typically used for dyskinesia, also became available as an extended release version as well. And all of these do have their role in improving wearing off. I think the one medication on this list that maybe is a little bit more challenging to try to use to achieve this is the extended release carbidopa-levodopa version. Even though it sounds like the extended release should be better, it really has its challenges. It's not as good of an extended release as we would like for it to be, and sometimes it's very irregular in its absorption. And so that's why I've just written here that it sometimes improves the wearing off and sometimes improves the dyskinesias. And in fact, for some patients, it may even worsen some of these motor complications. So it's not my favorite strategy to use for this problem, but certainly any of the other ones could be considered for helping to deal with those off symptoms. Now, patches you guys may have heard about. Really, the only one that's available on the market is rotigotine, known as Nupro. This is also a dopamine agonist and can be used just like the pramipixole extended release and the ropinirole extended release. One advantage to the rotigotine is that it's a 24-hour patch, and so this has shown benefits in terms of helping deal with those morning off times. And also there is some evidence about its ability to help improve non-motor symptoms of wearing off, and particularly things related to symptoms at night, like sleep issues and insomnia. There is another patch that is being developed, I think in Japan. It's a ropinirole patch. I don't have too much information about that, but that is potentially something to look forward to in the future. But it's the same medication class as the rotigotine. Now, if we turn our attention to drugs that have a shorter duration of onset, you can imagine that if somebody's starting to feel off, that they could take one of these medications and have it kick in quicker, rather than having to wait for the longer period of time that would generally be expected with taking some of the oral medications. And so there's several of these that are available. The first one that came out was Parcopa, which is really just an orally disintegrating version of carbidopa-levodopa. You just put it on the tongue, it dissolves, and you swallow it. But one real advantage of this medication is that it definitely kicks in a shorter amount of time compared to a oral, like a pill that you swallow. The other advantage is that you don't have to take it with water, and so a lot of people find that advantageous in their day-to-day activities. The other three that are on this list are what we refer to as the rescue therapies. And one of these is a levodopa inhalation powder. So it's called Inbrija. There's an apomorphine injection called Icahn, and an apomorphine sublingual film called Kinmobi. And each of these kind of kicks in a lot faster than a regular oral tablet. So 10 to 15 minutes, as you can see here. The problem is that even though they kick in a lot quicker, they don't last very long. So they don't make for good medication strategies for the kind of day-to-day, everyday management of Parkinson's symptoms. But because they're short-acting, they can be used to kind of bridge those gaps between doses pretty well. And there's different issues related to the different formulations, the different ways of administering these specific rescue therapies. But generally speaking, if patients can use them and they do respond to them, this can be an effective way to bridge the gaps between those doses where medications are not working as well and patients are experiencing off symptoms. Now, another strategy that has been developed is pump therapy. And so pumps, kind of pumping the medication into the system continuously has definitely been shown to improve off times as well as to improve dyskinesias in patients who have these motor fluctuations. And the one that is currently available on the market in the United States is Duopa. And so this is a carbidopa-levodopa enteral suspension. And we'll show pictures of this in just a moment, but basically it is a way to deliver the levodopa directly into the small intestine where we said that it gets absorbed. The challenge with it is that you have to have a PEG J tube in order to deliver the medication that way. And so that can be a challenge for some individuals, but can be highly effective, as we'll see. There are other pumps that are under investigation. One is kind of a combination of the carbidopa-levodopa enteral suspension, but with an added medication called entacapone. Entacapone is one of those COMT inhibitors that can help the levodopa kind of last longer and work better. And with this particular version of the pump, it has an improved pump design and also tends to reduce the amount of levodopa required. So there's certain advantages with that one. It's currently under investigation. There is a continuous subcutaneous apomorphine infusion. So apomorphine being the same thing that is in Icahn and Kinmobi, but can also be delivered via a pump. This has been improved in Europe for a number of years and has been highly successful in treating off times and improving on times by about 3 hours, as far as the studies are showing, and currently is in the process of going through its approvals here in the United States. A couple of new ones that are on the market are, that are being developed or investigated are ND0612 and ABBV951. So ND0612 is a liquid formulation of the carbidopa levodopa, which can be delivered subcutaneously in a pump. And again, I'll show you pictures of this in a moment. But it can improve off time by 2 or more hours. It can be delivered over a 24-hour infusion. Some of these details are currently still being investigated in clinical trials. The ABBV951 is another sort of formulation of carbidopa and levodopa. Here it's using a prodrug of each of those medications, but the advantage here is that it's better formulated into this liquid, which can then be absorbed more readily under the skin. And this is currently submitted at the FDA, and so we're waiting to see what the approval process will look like, but definitely some strong improvements here in terms of reducing off time and guaranteeing patients more on time during the course of their day. So this is the Duopa pump, the one that is currently available on the market. You can see this gentleman cartoon here who's got the pump placed into his stomach, and he's got this sort of pump apparatus that he has to carry around to actually deliver the medication. So the PEG J tube is inserted into the stomach, but the tip is advanced all the way into the small intestine, and that's where the medication is actually delivered, and that's where it's absorbed more readily and quickly. And what we as clinicians do is to program the pump so that patients can get a morning dose, so that they can kind of press the button, get their morning dose, and turn on pretty quickly. They have a continuous dose that they use during the course of the day, and they have the option of being able to use an extra dose throughout the day if needed. And generally speaking, patients will use this type of pump for up to 16 hours a day. And what the Duopa clinical profile really shows us is that it has a strong chance of reducing off time. In this study, a reduction of 4 hours compared to just a 2-hour reduction with general oral medication management, and it had a significant ability to improve on time in patients with Parkinson's without causing or worsening dyskinesias. And so this, again, can be very effective for managing those fluctuations. This is just another way to kind of look at that same information. If you look at the on time without dyskinesia in patients who are using the pump, that's shown here in the circles, patients are having more on time compared to patients who are just taking oral medications. And similarly, they have less off time compared to patients who are taking oral medications. And this was over 12 weeks of this particular investigation. In addition to the benefits in reducing off time and increasing on time, we have studies that also show that Duopa can improve non-motor symptoms, and things like sleep or fatigue, certain GI symptoms, urinary symptoms, sexual functioning, mood, and apathy. All of these have shown to be improved in individuals who are using Duopa therapy. And so we have the opportunity of tackling both kinds of symptoms, motor and non-motor off symptoms of Parkinson's. And this is a little bit of a complicated slide, but really what I wanted to show you, these are the new pumps, the ND0612 and the ABBV951 that are under development. You can kind of see that there's a pump apparatus and there is a kind of patch that is placed onto the abdomen. And so you would just carry around this pump, similar to an insulin pump, really. And this can be programmed to deliver the medication continuously, and it would get absorbed under the skin. So these are just two different versions of a pump that delivers medication subcutaneously. What I really wanted to show you was just the profile of these medications in terms of the dopamine concentrations. And what they're really doing is what we talked about, delivering that medication more continuously throughout the course of the day. Here is a 24-hour period. And so you can see that the medication levels are pretty constant. And that's exactly what we're looking to see when we are dealing with trying to manage these motor complications. Same thing with the ABBV951, and showing here the contrast between those medication levels when you're just taking oral medication. You can see the up and down and the on and the off, and that really doesn't happen with these pump infusions. So in conclusion, we know that off times can occur with increasing frequency and in increasing numbers of patients as Parkinson's progresses. We talked about how off times are associated with significant clinical and economical burdens, as well as impairments in quality of life. Although patients may sometimes have trouble describing their off symptoms, we know that they have several different strategies that they can use to deal with them beyond medication management. We talked about different approaches to make dopaminergic drug delivery more consistent and prolonged in Parkinson's disease. Some of the things like pumps and infusions are presently available or are under investigation and will hopefully ensure more continuous drug delivery, and as a consequence, improve on time while also reducing the amount of off time that patients have. And hopefully by doing that, we will be significantly improving quality of life for patients with Parkinson's disease. So with that, I'm going to stop my presentation and I would be happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Jimenez-Shahed, for this amazing presentation. And I hope many of you guys learned a few things regarding the managing of the off times. We did receive some pre-questions during our registration as well as during the webinar. But as a reminder, for those of you joining us via Zoom, you can submit your questions in the chat functions, or for those joining us on Facebook, you can submit them in the comment function, and we'll collect those and address those accordingly. So we'll go ahead and chime in. And some of the great questions, just before we dive deep in some of the specific questions, just kind of recapping of what the difference between on and off times are.
Yeah. So on times are when patients have better control of their Parkinson's symptoms. They're usually feeling pretty good and moving pretty well. Whereas off times are when Parkinson's symptoms are returning and they're starting to experience more tremor, stiffness, slowness, difficulty with walking and balance, and certainly a number of other non-motor symptoms can also be present during that time as well. Usually the on times are related to having high or better levels of dopamine in the system, and the off times are related to having lower levels.
Wonderful. And I know you mentioned about, the off time with the tremors. How often why do some individuals seem to have more tremors after taking, their medication like carbidopa and levodopa?
So I think that generally speaking, what we would expect to happen in somebody who has tremor is that when they take a dose of medication, hopefully they're taking an adequate dose of medication, that tremor should get better. I think infrequently we will hear that as patients are waiting for their medication to kick in, they experience kind of a worsening of their tremor, but then eventually once it kicks in, then everything sort of stabilizes. And this probably has to do with just the dynamics of the medication kind of getting into the brain, or maybe on the back end when it's kind of wearing off and kind of losing its efficacy. So I think there's those that will experience that kind of phenomenon, but I think it's less common. Usually we would expect for the tremor to get better.
Wonderful. And in terms of, maximizing our on times and then managing and minimizing the off times, what are your thoughts in terms of, or recommendations based on this presentation that, would be a quick go-to if you were to recap, as a quick solution?
Right. I mean, that's certainly the name of the game, right? Trying to stay on for as long as possible and trying to do that without having dyskinesias. And one thing that I really tried to highlight here is that it is important to be taking your medications on a regular schedule. So if we know that medications are going to kick in and wear off, but then you're not taking them consistently at a regular interval, then it's going to be all the more challenging to try to understand, kind of what the dynamics are there. So I think that's number one, whatever medications you're supposed to be taking, to take them regularly. I think other factors can definitely have an impact on how much symptoms or how many symptoms patients are experiencing with their fluctuations. So if patients haven't slept well, if they've maybe eaten, too much of a protein meal, if they've taken their medications around the same time as having a meal, if they have been more active physically and they're more tired, these are certainly situations where patients may have more of that. So trying to regulate those features as much as possible in your day-to-day functioning, making sure you're getting adequate rest and eating well and healthy and all of those kinds of things. I think those are also important ways to manage and to increase the chances of having good on times.
And how important is it in terms of the dosage of these medications? So for instance, if one were to lower the dose, but may perhaps increase the amount that they take during the day?
So I think there's a number of different strategies. Obviously, like I think in this talk, we weren't able to cover everything, but when patients are experiencing issues with medications kicking in and wearing off, and maybe they're also having dyskinesias, one of the strategies is to recommend that they take smaller doses more frequently. And that can certainly be helpful. And that's a way really the reason that it works is because you're getting a little bit more continuous drug delivery there. Having said that, it's a lot more of a challenge for individuals to stick to that kind of a schedule, right? So the shorter and shorter intervals that we recommend taking medications, I think it's a different kind of burden for patients to have to deal with. So that's, again, sometimes the reason that we try to use these combinations of medications.
Yeah. And then I know at the end we talked about the various, the pumps and then the DBS. Are there on and off times related to DBS or with the pump?
Yeah, so I think what you saw in some of the tables there was the total reduction in off time was maybe on the hour of 2 or 3 with some of those pumps. And those were in individuals who probably had 5 or 6 hours of off time. So it's not completely eliminating them, but substantially improving them. And what we're really kind of seeing with these pump therapies is that even if there are still some dips and fluctuations, that they're not as severe and they're not lasting as long. And so much more manageable from that standpoint because they're not completely wearing off in between the doses. And the same is true with deep brain stimulation. And actually, if you look at the improvements in on time, you might see more. I didn't really get a chance to talk too much about deep brain stimulation, but on time can also become much more consistent with DBS while also eliminating the dyskinesias. And you have that stimulation on 24 hours a day. And so it can also be very effective at reducing the off times. And some studies have really shown that patients can get 10 or 11 hours of good on time in a day with deep brain stimulation.
Okay, nice. And so in terms of like the extended release for Rittery, does that typically help with fluctuations?
Yeah, so in that slide that I showed you with the extended release formulations, there's the conventional carbidopa, levodopa extended release, and then there's the Rytary, which is the carbidopa, levodopa extended release capsules. So Rytary is formulated specifically to try to help reduce the off times. And what they've done is to put a combination of a little bit of the immediate release so the medication can kick in, but then more of an extended release component to it that helps the medication last longer. And it's done kind of in a more complex, like kind of pharmaceutical design way. But it is certainly one strategy that we can use to try to get those medications to last longer. So it, I think in some ways can be more effective and less problematic than the carbidopa, levodopa plain extended release.
And still in relation to this, to Rittery, is there a connection between compulsive behavior, mainly late in the day when the medication level is high?
So that's an interesting question. Compulsive behaviors in Parkinson's disease, such as maybe gambling or shopping or computer use, hypersexuality, these are behaviors that initially were reported in patients who were taking the dopamine agonist medication. So things like the pramipexole or the ropinirole or the rotigotine, those were more commonly associated with that particular side effect. Having said that, I think in situations where dopamine levels are high, there can be some of that kind of impulsive, compulsive behavior as well. And I've certainly, at least anecdotal, I don't know that it's true like across the board in every patient, but I've certainly, seen that happen in some of my patients where, as the medication sort of builds up during the day, they may have two things. One is more dyskinesia, but also some more of that impulsive behavior happening towards the end of the day. So it can happen, but I wouldn't say that that's a rule.
Okay, and just one last minute advice. I know you shared, a wealth of information in terms of, the ongoing medications that, they've been true to many patients with the Parkinson disease, as well as the new coming apparatus that we're seeing. Any word of advice, in terms of when we're talking about on and off, and for those that are still trying to fully grasp this understanding of the medication and the importance of continuous taking them, at a certain time?
Yeah, I think sometimes when people are struggling with it, we're trying to figure out, are they even having this problem, or what is it that's occurring that is creating whatever symptom it is that they're experiencing. I will often ask patients to keep diaries, and sometimes for maybe 2 or 3 days, it's worth it to try to take, and even write it down. Some of the diaries that are out there are like every 30 minutes, you can write down, am I feeling on? Am I feeling off? Am I feeling like I have dyskinesia? When did I take my medication? And if you can kind of diary that a little bit for 2 or 3 days, I think it can be very helpful, not only for yourself in understanding, what's happening in response to your medications, but then also for your physician, because then they can see some of the patterns emerging, or hopefully they can see some of the patterns emerging with that. So I think keeping track of things, trying to be consistent with the schedule, taking care of some of these other just sort of general health issues, good living kind of things, those are all really good things to try to keep in mind in order to manage these issues.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, Dr. Jimenez-Shahed, for your time and for this amazing presentation that you shared with us. And we're gonna go ahead and just share a couple announcements before we end today's webinar. But again, we do want to thank you for your presentation. And again, many thanks to all of you who joined us today via Zoom and Facebook. A follow-up email will be sent with a survey. Please tell us what you thought about today's program. You'll also receive a link to today's presentation and additional resources. Again, we always encourage you to please join us for upcoming PD Health at Home programs each week for you and your loved ones with Parkinson's, including Mindfulness Mondays, Wellness Wednesdays, and Fitness Fridays. And just as a reminder, we do have several events coming up. This one in particular, the Veterans Living with Parkinson's Disease, Thinking and Learning Changes Can Be a Concern. Join us in person or virtually to hear from Parkinson's disease experts and advocates about strategies and treatments to help prevent and slow cognitive decline. For more information, please contact the California chapter at california@parkinson.org. And again, if we didn't get a chance to address some of your questions that you had submitted, you can always submit them to our helpline by calling 1-800-4PD-INFO or email them at helpline@parkinson.org. You can use that same contact info to order our free resources, educational book series, and of course, our hospital safety kit. Thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.